Hello, everyone. My name is Guy Gordon, and I'm the Executive Director of the Institute for Citizen-Centered Service. And it's my pleasure to welcome all of you to today's webinar. The Institute for Citizen-Centered Service is extremely pleased to be able to present what I believe will be a very engrossing and educational webinar. It's our pleasure today to have with us from, I believe, in Victoria, Alison Bond, who is the Assistant Deputy Minister of the Employment and Labor Market Services Division in the Ministry of Social Development for the province of British Columbia. Alison will be giving a presentation based on the award-winning project that her area undertook and is in the process of undertaking. The focus for this presentation is the fact that this project was the 2011 winner of the ICCS Excellence in Service Delivery Award. This award is presented annually by the Public Sector Service Delivery Council in Canada, and is given to a team and or project that demonstrates excellence in service delivery. I believe that all of you will really benefit from what is essentially an outstanding example of innovation in service delivery. The format that we will be using today is the one that we typically use here at the ICCS. We will be asking Alison to make a presentation, and over the course of that period of time, we will invite participants of the webinar to submit any comments or questions through me via the chat box, which should be on the lower right-hand portion of your screen. I will collect these, and then after Alison's had a chance to deliver her presentation, I will pass these on to Alison for her response. Finally, what I'd like to say is, as is the normal practice, we will be recording this webinar, and you will see it posted on the new ICCS website in relatively short order, and we'll certainly give people who are registered for today's event a notification of when it's been posted. So, without any further ado, I would love to turn the mic and presentation over to Alison and thank her so much for taking the time out of her busy schedule to present to the audience today. Alison, over to you.
Great, thanks very much. And I'm on video too, which is disturbing for me because I have to watch myself make the presentation, but I hope a little bit more interactive for you folks out there. So good morning to everybody in the West and good afternoon to everybody else. Really excited to talk about this project today. It was a fantastic project to be involved in. You know, I'm personally really committed to integrated service delivery and finding more innovative ways of delivering services to British Columbians. And this was a real challenge for us, this project, getting it off the ground and figuring out how it is we wanted to approach it, and then going for it. So I'm going to give you a bit of background. I'll talk about what our mandate was. I'll talk about how we approached the project, what we achieved in the end, some of the outcomes, and I think probably the most interesting part is going to be talking a bit about what we learned through this around integrated service delivery. It's probably not rocket science for many of you, but some of the very, very practical lessons were useful to us, and we've actually been applying them, and I can talk to you a little bit about other things we've been doing since then. So in application of the lessons so that you can see how we've applied those lessons and move forward on other projects. So the mandate is interesting, but almost, I guess, in some ways more interesting was how we received our mandate. So it was January, shortly after I returned from vacation, that I was given a call because ministries had been going to Cabinet and Treasury Board and asking for funding to do outreach for homeless individuals across British Columbia. And what had been happening was each of the ministries had been going forward individually, health authorities had been going forward individually, regional offices had been going forward individually, seeking additional funding. And what was interesting, I think, for Cabinet, for our decision makers, Cabinet and Treasury Board, was that it appeared as though each of these agencies was coming forward completely individually without having conversations with one another about how perhaps they might collectively address homelessness within their communities. And that isn't to suggest that there wasn't good integration going on in the communities, it's just that the tackling of that issue appeared to be very disaggregated. And so in January, I was asked to very quickly come up with a plan to address homelessness in British Columbia. And we had about probably 4 weeks to pull all the ministries together and come up with a way that we could tackle this. Obviously, the first way was to narrow the scope. So in other words, let's test it in 5 communities instead of everywhere across BC. We were instructed to use no additional money. So they didn't want us looking to add funding to each of the programs, that we had to move funding around. We were told to give priority access to any services to the group of individuals that we called chronically homeless. And by that, we meant those who had been in and out of homelessness for more than a year and who had both mental health and addictions issues. So they were then given a priority access to services. We sort of had, like I say, about 3 or 4 weeks to pull the whole idea together, and we decided to make it very community-based. Again, the timeline was sort of challenging us to make it community-based because we had to get the communities engaged, but at the same time, we knew that there's already stuff going on in the communities. We wanted to take advantage of it. They understood what was going on in their communities, and what we needed to do was to create both the mandate and the pressure, really, in some ways, and the importance to focus in on this community, on this cadre of individuals, chronically homeless. So working with the communities and so on, we pulled together what we called the Homelessness Intervention Project in the 5 communities that you see on your screen: Prince George, Kelowna, Vancouver, Surrey, Victoria. We were given basically another 30 days to make it actually operating on the ground. And we had some interesting conversations because a lot of people wanted to do more work within the communities to understand the population in that community. They wanted to study it a little bit more. And I think what we all recognized was that actually there had been plenty of studies on chronic homelessness. We knew what it would take to house these people. We knew that it took wraparound services, focused attention. We knew that housing was important and you needed to do that first. We knew that we could find other services for these individuals once they were in housing, but getting them into housing was the first thing that we needed to do, and it had to be supportive of housing. So we already knew that stuff. We didn't need to study it. And we knew that communities across BC, and particularly those communities, had been doing some really, really good work. And so we wanted to build off that. So a couple of things that were different from what you might normally see in a government project. The first thing was we were allowing flexibility within communities to adapt to what they already had. The second thing was it was a bias to action. It was move forward quickly and get the job done, and allowing, not just allowing for that flexibility in the communities, but allowing the communities to come back to us and say, here are the systemic problems that are getting in our way, and how can you help us address those? So that's what we did. We said, we pushed the stuff out to the communities. We went and talked to the communities. We engaged with them on what they were going to do. We had integrated reporting so that we would know who was being housed where. We had information coming up to us collectively that said how many individuals we were housing, how long they'd stayed in housing, and so on. We actually had a single source of information for that through a website. And talk a bit more about how that got tricky, because it certainly was tricky as we move forward. And also, we created an opportunity for the communities to share with one another what they were doing so they could learn from one another. And that's something we don't do very well when we have communities that are working incredibly well and not, for some reason, able to share that across other communities, taking advantage of what was already working and continuing to push our success. So we launched in March 2009, just a couple of months after we were given the instructions to develop something, design it, create it, and then implement it. And again, it was about getting results and getting results quickly. One of the interesting things we learned early and before the launch was that there's a general, and this is no surprise to those of you on the phone, I'm sure, there's a general cynicism about our ability as government to achieve something quickly. And between all of the communities, and we had also a provincial steering committee that managed the whole project, what we've heard from folks was, well, we've looked at all these communities. We know that in our supportive housing units we have 200 vacancies. We were expecting to be able to house 200 people within the first couple of weeks, and what people told us was, after the first 2 weeks is over, this project is done because there are no more vacancies, and it'll all be finished. And what we said was, okay, well, that's fine, and the communities can work through using those vacancies, and we're going to continue to push this project. That we will evidence, if in fact it's true that after those 200 vacancies are gone, we can no longer house anybody, then the evidence will be in that what we're looking for is additional capacity. But what we didn't let that assumption do is grind us down to the place of being unable to take any action at all. So, and in fact, I'll demonstrate for you how it was that, in fact, the vacancies was not the number one issue for housing the chronically homeless, interestingly, and we certainly pushed long past those first 2 weeks and onward. But those kinds of assumptions were the things that could have most certainly stalled us from the beginning and moving forward. So in each of those communities, they did things very, very differently. We had some real standouts that moved quickly. We had some communities that started slowly, but through crises that were happening on the ground, moved more quickly. And I can talk about each of them individually later on if you like, because they're all very, very different stories. And just to highlight them, in Surrey, British Columbia, which is one of our fastest growing communities in Canada, you had local government that was very, very interested in doing something about the homeless within their community. Their community, the homeless were very disaggregated. They were all over. They weren't in a specific downtown core. They were everywhere, so finding them was an issue. But what we found there was, while the government folks were perhaps a little bit cynical, the community folks were ready to jump on board, as was the local government. And the result was that Surrey ended up being one of our real standouts when it comes to integrated service delivery and designing that on the ground in a community to suit the particular challenges of the community. We had another community, Victoria, which was really tough to get off the ground, actually. And what was interesting in Victoria was it took a crisis within the community for us to finally find a way to collaborate with one another. And we can talk a bit about some of the things that got in our way as we move forward. But I'm going to tell you a bit about what happened in the Lower Mainland, because here was a place where you have so many organizations that are involved in serving the chronically homeless, the homeless, those with mental health and addiction. You had lots of really good initiatives already. You had infrastructure. There's something called the Burnaby Center for Mental Health and Addictions. It's an extraordinary facility, and it works specifically with this group of people. And you have supportive housing in the downtown east side. And what we discovered early was that there was a bit of a stall in the Lower Mainland, particularly in Vancouver, because people felt that there was just no way to flow clients in and out of those facilities. So if you were chronically homeless, you went to the Burnaby Center and then you were stuck. And you were there, until housing could be found elsewhere. And so there was a bit of a cork in the system. Same was true if you went to a supportive housing facility, you never moved on even if you were ready. And so what we decided really early, like in April, shortly after the project was launched, was we needed to get all of the players into a room together and talk about how do we, what is it that we need to address? What's the single most important systemic barrier in the downtown east side, particularly but in Vancouver, and how do we address it, and what actions are we going to take? So we had a one-day workshop. It was excellent. We came up with 79 actions, which was far too many, and decided that what we would have to do is focus that in on a few that we could actually tackle and manage going forward. And so we got together over a couple of additional teleconferences and focused in on the things that would genuinely make a difference to the client flow. And if you could make a difference to the client flow, you could house more clients and you can get more of the chronically homeless off the street. So identified a few things just by way of example. The first one was a lot of the folks that were identified off the street and moved to the Burnaby Centre for Mental Health and Addictions weren't ready for a residential treatment centre, so they left. And it was unsuccessful. Or they held up a bed, but they weren't ready for it. And so between BC Housing and Vancouver Coastal Health and others, they created a pre-Burnaby residential sort of holding station where individuals who were chronically homeless could find a place to live, learn how to live in a residential location, and then, if necessary, move on to treatment at the Burnaby Centre. The Burnaby Centre being really a treatment center. And that freeing up some of those beds in the pre-Burnaby piece allowed us to focus more on success for the people that were in Burnaby. Very, very helpful. The next thing we found was there was no place to move people out of Burnaby. So sometimes people would leave Burnaby and go right back to where they were before. Sometimes they definitely found supportive housing, which was great, but there was something in between supportive housing and the Burnaby Centre that was necessary. So people who required ongoing treatment, they weren't ready to move into supportive housing, but they were taking up a very costly bed in the Burnaby Centre. And so we came up with, again, pilot projects in what is Riverview, which is a mental health facility that is actually being they're actually unwinding it and have been unwinding it for just about a decade now. And there were two buildings within Riverview that the Provincial Health Services Authority felt that we could use that didn't need a ton of capital in order to make them operational again, and would provide the right level of treatment and residential care that they needed. And so we created a male facility for men and a facility for women, 22 beds in each that were kind of your transitional piece. Most of the people we were expecting to stay there for up to a year and get what they needed around them in terms of just a little more support than you get in supportive housing, additional treatment, and created the opportunity to free up the beds in the Burnaby Centre, which were much more expensive. We also worked between the health authorities and BC Housing to identify beds within supportive housing for those who could do it, to actually move people out of Burnaby Centre into supportive housing. So, and there were some bottlenecks in the system. We identified as well an idea to create an urgent response center, which is an idea that's been floating around actually in the downtown east side for some time. It's had lots of people who want to see it happen. Police really are keen on it, because what's happening is you get people who what they really need is treatment, and they end up being in the correctional system instead. So lots of good ideas around the Urgent Response Center. Never quite got that one off the ground for a variety of reasons, mostly around, interestingly, less around the availability of capital and more around the location. Where would it go, and what population would it serve, and how would it work? So there's still more work to do there. It was actually in the news again just last year. I think it's an idea that probably will come back and certainly will help manage that client flow. Once this sort of client flow stuff was done and we were able to work on these four pieces, it really allowed the team in Vancouver to focus in on just housing the chronically homeless throughout the system. So once there was this sense that we could manage some of the systemic issues in the downtown east side in particular, it really helped people to free their minds in a way around continuing to work within the project. So they were less cynical about the ability of the project to deliver. And in fact, this particular component of the project won a Premier's Award in the first year of the project because it really managed to resolve some of the systemic issues that had been there for a long time, and managed to do it quickly. I mean, really, it was a one-day workshop, a couple more teleconferences, then we had specific work streams working on each of these pieces, and by the end of the year, we had basically new beds operating in parts of BC to resolve an issue that had really been one long-standing issue in the downtown east side of the Lower Mainland for a long time. Overall, what we achieved was actually pretty remarkable when you think about the fact that when we started, what our steering committee said was, you're going to house 200 people, you're going to run out of housing, and you're going to be done. You can see from this slide that actually we housed almost 4,000 people over 2 years. The length of the project was 18 months. It was extended by another 6 months because it was going so well. We were able to monitor those that were housed and found that 85% have remained stably housed, remembering that these are the chronically homeless. They're arguably the most complex client group that we have in British Columbia because they have been cycling in and out of homelessness for more than 12 months. They have these chronic mental health and addictions problems as well. And when we say cycling in and out of homelessness for 12 months, some of them for many, many years. It just had to be more than 12 months. So finding them housing and keeping them housed, 85% of them with it up to a year was remarkable. We got people into the system, which, while you might think that isn't such a big deal, for these folks that very, very disconnected from the system, generally speaking, managed to get folks on income assistance. If they weren't on income assistance, it typically meant they were receiving old age pensions and disability pensions from the federal government. And interestingly, we actually introduced one of the programs, and this was used from an existing program because, again, we didn't have any new money, and we can talk a bit about what that actually meant. But we took an existing program and we kind of retooled it a little bit for this population, and it was an existing employment program, and what it provided was very high-level supports for these folks in order to move them to employment. Now, interestingly, it was modeled after a program that we already had, but that program wasn't necessarily an employment program. It didn't have employment as a stated outcome. This new one that we introduced, we actually said employment is what we're trying to achieve, and they actually ended up getting far better results on the employment side than the long-standing program that we'd had that didn't have stated outcome of employment. So we did have folks actually reporting work income over the course of a project, and disproving the sort of assumption that these folks would never, certainly never within a year, be able to find and maintain employment. So we were quite excited about that as well. The way that we managed measuring outcomes and information associated with this project, I'm sure it's no surprise to any of you, is probably one of the most complicated pieces. And I'll just tell you a little bit about what we wanted to do and some of the issues that we ran into, because I'll go over it again when we talk about challenges, but I just want to focus for a second on the information piece, because there's some really important lessons in here for me for the next time we have to do something like this, but also I think collectively for us to just understand what some of the challenges are. So the first thing was, in those first few weeks when we were designing the program, we actually all sort of collectively agreed that we needed to have one place to do the basics, right? And the basics being, how many people are we housing? Are they staying housed? Are they chronically homeless? Just a very simple stuff. We didn't have to have any complex information in there. So we didn't have to talk about what services they're receiving or anything. We just wanted the counting, right? And making sure that the counting was accurate. Everybody agreed that that was important, and we had a single website for everyone to go to. One of our agencies, however, said, you know what, actually we've invested a lot of money in this other client tracking system, so instead of using yours, we're going to use ours, and we'll just send you a report, and then, yeah, you can combine them and you'll still get an accurate count. We didn't have, I think what we decided that probably that made some sense, and also we realized we weren't going to win the argument in the few weeks that we had in order to resolve it. And so we said we would try it. That was, I would have to tell you, a mistake. And the reason why is that between the two systems, we know that from time to time, people were double counted. And so we ended up having to go backwards and check and recheck and ensure accuracy. So the numbers that you saw were accurate, but that was the accuracy as a result of a ton of work that we had to do, which we really shouldn't have had to do if we were all using the single website in order to track and manage the numbers, the outputs, and the outcomes. That would have made a lot more sense. And I think, you know, bowing to the pressure of other agencies who say we have a better system, it works great for us, and actually for the people who deliver the services, it makes more sense for them to use only the one system and not have to train them on a new one. I mean, I think we were all feeling like, you know, anything we could do to help the frontline workers make their jobs easier would be good. So it was all meant. We meant well in having the two systems, but at the end of the day, it would have been better for us collectively to have one place to measure, one place to manage, and just simplify it as much as possible so it had the least possible impact. So I think that was one thing I wanted to say that was really important. The other thing is that we created, in order to measure outcomes, so in order to understand really what we were doing and how it was working, all of the ministries were terribly concerned, and rightfully so, about ensuring privacy protection on the part of the clients. So the only way to measure outcomes across many different ministries, of course, is to share client information. And this is at a high level, at a provincial level. Sharing client information, I think it's a bit of a no-brainer from my perspective, but obviously we have to make sure that we're protecting privacy, and that's really, really important, particularly when it comes to things like health records, and they're managing mental health and addiction and so on. And we don't need to share a ton of that information, but we do need access to it. We came up with a very, very complex system where they would gather the information on each client, have a client identifier number as opposed to a client name, compare that across the systems. We had to create complex and sort of tight agreements, research agreements with all of the agencies that were going to contribute this information. All the information would go into a secure site, and there would be somebody in the site who would sort of remove all of the client identification and just look at what was submitted to them. Whole bunch of problems with that. First one was the individuals who were in the secure site didn't necessarily understand all the different databases that they had access to, and the result was that it was extremely difficult for them to understand the data, very hard for them to really, at the end of the day, measure the outcomes, and didn't really have enough time. We didn't create an integrated system. We just created a kind of a monster for all of this information to go into and people to try to figure out, is this the same client we're talking about? Is this a different client? What does all this data mean to us when it comes to measuring outcomes and outputs and so on? Very, very complex. The other thing that the research agreement did was it restricted the people that were in the secure lab from going out and looking for information within the other databases, and the result was that they couldn't check back and see whether or not that client was a client in other places. They couldn't check in, they couldn't go out, in other words, into other systems. So not something I would recommend, the research agreement as a tool to measure outcomes. I'm sure that there's a better way, and we need to work through some of the complications around that, but we sure learned a lot about the pitfalls of information sharing agreements. Interestingly, where we succeeded was information sharing agreements at the community level in order for the agencies to share information with one another on clients so that they could provide the best possible services to those clients and what the clients needed in order to improve. So that was great. That worked really, really well. We modeled it off of an existing information sharing agreement, so it happened pretty quickly. It took a while for the communities to sort of figure out how they would make that agreement, what they wanted that agreement to look like within their own communities, but basically we ended up doing really well at a community level. So when it came to actually understanding what was going on the ground, information sharing wasn't such a big deal. It was at the measuring outcomes level that we started to have trouble. In the end, in fact, the secure lab didn't work. So we got some stuff out of it, which is the count, the output stuff that you saw. You know, how many people did they get housing? How long did they have housing, et cetera. So we got some of the basic stuff, but we didn't really get the outcome work. And we have an existing research agreement with SFU. They have access to a number of databases across government. I don't know why we didn't get this in the first place. They don't have access to all the data because they're fairly restricted in terms of the clients that they're accessing. But what we did was we engaged them at the conclusion of the project to tell us what they thought of the outcome of the project. And their view was, as we felt it was from our anecdotal and output information, was that in fact the outcome data indicated that our integration initiative, which was very action-oriented, very focused on that particular cadre of individuals, got them into housing, wraparound services, and so on, and integrated services worked much more effectively than other initiatives that had happened before. Some of that information is actually posted on our website now. So things that we learned through this that were incredibly successful. The first is that it was pretty clear to us what our mandate was. We had to get people into housing and keep them housed, and we had to monitor, track, and measure that progress. We reported that progress out up and down and across our organizations so that everybody knew where we were at from week to week. All of the communities were required to report in. We were very disciplined about the reporting, and we were very disciplined in requiring that the communities meet their targets. So, you know, we may have all collectively said, you know, we'll only house 200 people and that'll be that, but that didn't mean we weren't going to push on continuing to house. And over the course of the full 18 months of the project and then the extension of the additional 6 months, the communities were very keen. They were seeing the results of their focus and attention on this particular community group. And they were getting those results and they were meeting their targets, and they were measuring and monitoring targets. And that in and of itself actually kept people engaged in the project throughout the course of the project. The governance and accountability structure was incredibly important because, again, discipline is really important when you're doing integrated initiatives. Communication is incredibly important. And we needed not just to have that strong mandate, which came directly from Cabinet, which was great. We had a lead ministry, which was really important so that everybody knew who was sort of making the decisions and pushing people across. And they all knew that they were accountable, in fact. And the few times that we ran into, you know, folks who didn't want to play, it didn't last very long because we had such a clear mandate, and deputy ministers were engaged at a high level. So we had a steering committee of assistant deputy ministers. We had deputy ministers that we could go to if we needed to. We never did, by the way. And then we had the community organizations, the community groups that reported up to us at the steering committee level. We had, again, that project discipline within the project so that we were forcing people to talk to us about what was working and what wasn't working. If a particular community had a slow week, during our weekly conference calls, we said, you know, what's going on? Tell us what's happening. People were very open with one another. And while they might have been a little cranky sometimes at the beginning of the call, by the end, it was always very solution focused. And the action orientation sort of permeated the whole project. People knew that the idea wasn't to study it, but it was to do it and then fix it if it wasn't working. That worked really well for us, I think, because you saw immediate results. And unlike so many of our projects where we start in a planning phase that goes on and on and on, we knew enough about the problem that we could just go for it. And anyone who said we needed to study it more, we could say, what else do we really need to know? We know the people. We're not going to be able to count them any more accurately than we have before. We know what they need. We know what's been successful. Let's just do it, and let's fix things as we go, and allow each community to kind of do that as we move forward. The resourcing was an issue, and I said earlier that our mandate was no new resources. It's true, we never went to Treasury Board and asked for more money to any organization. It's also true that organizations had to reallocate within So it isn't as though no new money went to this project, it's that no new money went to organizations as a whole. And I think that's one of the things that some of the organizations told us is be careful about telling everybody there was no new money. There was money assigned to this that wasn't previously assigned to the chronically homeless. Was it a good investment? Absolutely. And do people understand then that sometimes you have to reallocate resources in order to address a particular priority? Absolutely. Communication was critically important. We had to have the communication reach throughout organizations, across organizations, and down through to the front lines of organizations. We needed to make sure that communication was always working. That's why that governance structure and the discipline within the governance structure was so important. We needed to know people knew what was going on, what the instructions were, that they identified issues that they brought up to us at the provincial level if we were the ones that needed to sort it out. But the communication was all the time within communities and between communities and between communities and the provincial level. As I said, the information sharing and at the client level on the ground ended up actually working pretty well. But what our community organizations said, our community group said, was it would have gone much faster if we put some thought to developing that common framework earlier. It came a little bit later than perhaps it could have. Part of that was just a function of the fact that we had to get things up and running so quickly. But definitely, you know, having some kind of a common framework, which the privacy commissioners already looked at and approved, probably would have moved things a little bit faster. That being said, they all also said that things got done, they got done quickly, and it worked for them. The collecting and evaluating data part was by far the trickiest part of the project. You know, ideally, we would have had one system that all the information would go into, you know, get cleaned up, integrated, bada bing, bada boom, where we know everything there is to know about the outcomes on the client. There was no way in the time frame that we had that we could do that. And at the end of the day, it would have been, ideally, it would have been better if we could have actually had the subject matter experts helping us work through all of the data, looking for the clients and all the different data streams. We would have had to have money and more money in the project than we had, which wasn't much. It was all out of existing funds. The central project team was teeny tiny. It was, you know, 4 or 5 of us really. And so, you know, we really would have had to invest more money in order to make that data evaluation piece work really, really well. That being said, you know, I still believe that we could have done it with the existing data. Like we didn't need to create a big, monstrous, integrated data system. But I think we probably could have spent more time thinking about the structure of collecting the data, who was going to do the evaluation, how they were going to do it, and what they were evaluating in advance so that the research agreement or whatever information sharing agreement we came up with better met our needs, and that just isn't what we ended up with at the end of the day. We also learned very clearly through this project that integration of services works for complex client groups like this, where you're looking at a whole number of services from corrections right through to health and everything in between. The integrated service delivery model helped us to quickly understand and identify service gaps for dealing with this client population. So I talked to you a bit about the lower mainline client flow model. That was really, really important for us to understand what some of those real quirks in the system were so that we could uncork them and get clients flowing through the system. It would have been really a lot harder for us to understand those if we didn't have all of the organizations in a room talking that stuff through. It's not as though they don't know it already. It's not as though they can't identify it, but identifying it in a process where the intent is to resolve it actually made that conversation go a lot easier. Nobody blamed anybody, and that was really important as well. It was all about understanding how the system worked and didn't work for this client group. But without a doubt, the integrated service delivery model worked really well. Places like Surrey, it's really just part of the way they work now. It is, as we all know, a bit of a no-brainer to do it that way, but that, I don't know, it seems to continue to be complex and complicated for governments in particular to get off the ground. So where we're at now, in those communities that HIP was operating, and we always said that HIP was a project. The intent was for the practices that were developed as a result of the project to continue on within those communities. They are. So all those communities continue to have integrated service delivery models that are operating. The lessons haven't been lost. Some other communities have taken it on and run with it. We released a comprehensive report that looked at some of the outcome information I was telling you about, but also had interviews at every level within all of the organizations, from the frontline workers right up through to the assistant deputy ministers and deputies that were involved in it, and very interesting reading some of the evaluation of the project, just as a curiosity, I guess, not surprising, but curious nonetheless. When the evaluators talk to the executive level within organizations, so those are the folks that are working in the headquarters of organizations, they said, HIP was good, it was great to have that, but really, everything would have happened anyway, and it was fine. It didn't really get in our way, but it didn't really move things along, contrary to the actual data that we have, which is interesting. When you talk to the front line, they said, without this project, we wouldn't have been able to overcome some of those issues that had been in our way over and over and over again over the past many years and sometimes decades. So what's curious is kind of the knowledge gap between what people see happening on the front line and what people in headquarters think is really going on and what the data evidence is. And certainly the data was far more consistent with what the story was on the front line than it was in some of the headquarters organizations. I think at a broad provincial level, did we solve any huge systemic issues? No, but in some ways there weren't any huge systemic issues to solve. The systemic issues were governments need to collectively operate as more of a collective around these complex client groups, talk to one another, wrap the services around them, and do it more efficiently. Again, not so complicated after all. We are applying the lessons from the Homelessness Intervention Project to other groups. We have an integrated offender management project so that offenders leaving institutions aren't immediately thrust back into their old ways of doing things. All of the same lessons apply. We have a family and youth partnership initiative, which is about targeting young families on income assistance or youth on income assistance to try to, again, look at integrated service delivery for those folks and improve their integration within society and their independence within society at an earlier age and stop the cycle of welfare for some of our families and young people in the province of BC. We're using some of the same lessons. So in HIP, we had key workers as being the person who was going to be the contact to ensure all of the services were integrated. We're using key workers for these groups as well. Key workers appear to be the best way to ensure wraparound services for the individuals, integrated services for the individuals. Information sharing, I mean, obviously lots of systemic issues, lots of cultural issues, lots of people relying on a whole slew of legal opinions to stop them from sharing information that's necessary to share to help clients, and we still have a lot of work to do there. I think a lot of it is cultural and less based on what they might call legal requirements. And data gathering and evaluation, we definitely have confirmation of the validity of our approach, the integrated service delivery. It would be great if we could do even better evaluation. We're going to ask SFU to kind of do a follow-up if they can on those same clients and see whether things have improved a little. What they noted was, we're spending a little more money on those individuals on healthcare in the first 2 years. That's to be expected because they're now in a system which is helping them get better. What will be interesting is, another year from now or 2 years after the close of the project, are those folks back in the same place that they were before? So I think that's all I had for you. I'm happy to take any questions if you have any.
Okay, thank you very much, Alison. That was excellent. I really do appreciate the material and the thoroughness at which you covered it. We have questions starting to come in, so I'll start with the first one we've received. Can you describe some of the places where you move folks into and how they are supported?
Yeah. So we have BC Housing as the Crown Corporation, and they were obviously one of our most important partners in this project. And they, like everyone else, created some priority spots for these clients, but they couldn't do it at the expense of all the other spots that they had. It really depended on the community. So in Vancouver, we were heavily reliant on the supportive housing that BC Housing ran. In Victoria, they didn't have as much supportive housing, actually. And so while there were a lot of spots that went to the existing supportive housing within Victoria, we also tried to do scattered site housing where they went into private housing with rent subsidies, which again BC Housing runs, and so we were able to increase the rent subsidies in Victoria to get people into private sector housing and move the supports to where they are. In Kelowna and Surrey, it was a combination of both, really. But in Kelowna, they had very little supportive housing, and so most of it was scattered site private sector housing with support sort of tacked on. And in Prince George, it was a combination of both. So they already had supportive housing up in Prince George that they were planning, and they actually tried to create or target a number of beds for the individuals that were part of this project. It was interesting because for sure people expected when we did the assessment across all 5 communities there were only 200 vacancies, and that was based on BC Housing sort of looking at their supportive housing vacancy list, so it was an accurate number. But curious that we could get to a place where we housed so many more people than was originally anticipated through a combination of freeing up additional spaces within the supportive housing, as well as looking at private sector housing. So that number closing in on 4,000 is a combination of private and public sector housing and supportive housing. It's interesting because from reflecting back on how successful we were through this and how successful we could continue to be, I think we started to get more and more push towards rent subsidies and private market housing, because then you can find a person a home that they can stay in. Whereas if you go into some of the supportive housing units, the capital costs are really high, for one thing, and secondly, what if you need to dial back the supports? They're in that supportive housing place, so that the cost is much higher, and they may or may not have continuous need for all those supports. So there was a significantly more interest in moving away from the supportive housing expensive capital cost piece, and much more towards thinking about how would we be able to create additional private sector spaces. And some of our communities do a really good job working with landlords, because that's your key, right, is supporting both the landlords and the people in the housing. So if something goes wrong with the individual in that apartment, how quickly can we get people in to help the landlord through that and make sure that they don't give up on the folks going forward. So it's a real combination of both, and I think for sure leaning more towards private sector housing over time as being much more cost effective, better for the client, because they get to have a home and stay in their home, and so on. Hope that answers the question.
Thanks, Alison. That's great. I'm really glad at the end of your response you kind of reiterated the observation of how you were able to achieve 20 times the original sort of projected impact. But also, that's a really great illustration of the impact of service delivery on policy and that kind of interplay. But it just underscores the notion to say that so that from a system-wide perspective, the capacity is much more than you might have originally thought it was, which to me kind of goes back to one of the benefits of having somebody push the system as a whole rather than the individual participants in the system who think that they're maximizing performance by optimizing their own little piece of the system. So from having a bit of a systems thinking background, that's kind of what I got out of that. I have another question here, and it relates to the issue of the data and evaluation. And I guess the question is, has this effort led you to think about, um, from a government-wide perspective, trying to develop some policies or programs to help um, the government improve its overall program evaluation capabilities? There's obviously a lot of great lessons that you learned, but uh, but 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 also a lot of great practices that you've established, and those I would think would be very well could be leveraged themselves by others and by other governments. So I'm just curious as to if any of that thinking has emerged.
Yeah, there's a couple of things going on in BC. There's, I'm sure you folks have heard of it. There's the integrated case management system. Phase 2 was just implemented on April 2nd, and that looks at having a single case management system for the Ministries of Children and Families and Social Development across all of their business areas, which is employment, welfare, child welfare, and child care, and so on. So, I mean, there's for sure that's going to make life easier for those clients. But interestingly in government, our program evaluation tends to be very program centric. So we're very good at evaluating a single program within a single ministry. Where we got tripped up in this one was evaluating a single project across numerous ministries, all of whom collect and manage their data differently. And, definitely from an evaluation perspective, moving like we are with integrated case management system to a single system is ideal, probably not immediate as a solution. And so, the learnings that we had around, like, we've published all of our learnings. We've shared them across, our chief information officer is very familiar with what worked and what didn't work. So if we're to run into that again, we're obviously going to work on it. The biggest learnings for us were in the construct of the information sharing for the purposes of outcome measurement. And the construct was through this research agreement. And the research agreement itself, while it seemed to make sense in the first instance, because what it did was it leaned heavily towards protection of privacy. And not in the sense of protecting everyone from seeing an individual client's name. And the result was that we were hampered in our ability to go back into those systems and find clients and determine whether, what other services they're accessing and so on. So in terms of how we constructed the research agreement, how we constructed the ability to measure the outcomes, all of that stuff we absolutely have learned from and have shared that learning across organizations, and I've spoken to it a number of times, and hopefully we'll be in a place of improving the way we measure and evaluate outcomes over time. It's interesting because what we've done in getting SFU to do this work is because they already have research credentials and credibility. The issues associated with protection of privacy and so on kind of disappear because they aren't a government agency receiving all this client data and then looking through it. What they are is a non-government research organization who's doing that work. So that's kind of a good idea. It's a bit disappointing from my perspective that we couldn't figure out a way to do that efficiently within government. I think that if we'd made a couple of changes to the research agreement earlier on, if we hadn't constructed the way we had, we wouldn't have been caught as we were later on in the project, being unable to really say with some certainty that, yep, we figured it out and we have an accurate way of dealing with the issues. So, I guess short answer is we learned a lot. We shared the learning. These learnings are specific to integrated programming when you're sharing across ministries. We do have the integrated case management system, which is going to help us across those two ministries anyway on the social side, but the lessons are applicable across the board, and people are familiar with what worked and what didn't work.
Fantastic. Two more questions, and then we'll wrap up for the day. What was the motivation for organizations to commit to reallocating funds to be part of this project?
Well, interestingly, our mandate was to not have additional resources. So arguably, none of the agencies had to reallocate. What I think happened was, and this is me speaking my conjecture, what I think happened was because we got the project off the ground so quickly, kind of unheard of really when you think about it from a government perspective, because we got it off the ground so quickly, and because within just a matter of a couple of weeks we'd far surpassed our expectations on what we could do, remembering that agencies don't come to these projects thinking they'd like to skewer them. I mean, they really do want success, and they really do want to help these chronically homeless clients. And I think what they saw was, gosh, maybe this project is going to actually achieve something that we haven't been able to achieve before. And so where they might have been able to say, we don't have to lend any additional resources, what actually ended up happening was they said, oh, I think this is actually going to get us somewhere. The other thing that happened was we said consistently that we're going to track and monitor exactly what we've committed and how we've invested and what it's achieved in order to report that back to Cabinet, because we had regular reports to Cabinet. And so the other thing that agencies saw was the ability to make an argument for ongoing funding for certain things that were done that were very, very successful. So if you look at the numbers, for example, of people housed in Vancouver, they were over 2,000. So that's, more than half of the people that were housed in downtown in Vancouver somewhere. And a lot of that was due to some of the supportive housing that came online as BC Housing was moving through their capital agenda. But what it did was it allowed them to say, hey, this is working for these clients, and this is an investment that's worthwhile. In the Lower Mainland, when you thought about those two additional sites that were set up as post-Burnaby Centre sites, that was a totally new service delivery model for those individuals, and success there meant the ability to say we need that transitional housing. And then the other piece was additional money going to rent subsidies, and proving that actually rent subsidies with support lent to those subsidies was both less expensive and just as, if not more successful than going through supportive housing. So it was the idea behind the whole idea behind the project was action breeds success, breeds more success. And so the more that our agencies saw success, and the fact that we were completely transparent about what we were saying and what we weren't saying, about how we were evaluating, about what we were putting forward to Cabinet, the more they felt, I think, that there was an opportunity to shift their resources around to make business cases that perhaps they hadn't been able to make before, and all of that was evidenced as well in the final project report. So I think if there was a motivation, it was probably cynical at first, and then seeing the success really in a matter of weeks meant some internal motivation to try to participate, be part of that success, say you were part of that success, and then make an argument going forward for what worked and what didn't work.
Okay, fabulous. That's fabulous, Allison. So the last question is, I hope that what you'll be able to do is maybe forward to us, or if you've got off the top of your head, the URL where people could find the comprehensive copy of the comprehensive report. I did take a quick peek on the website and can't quite find it very easily. Yeah.
I'll forward you the URL.
Okay. Well, with that, what I want to do is say, here, I'll even turn my camera on here. Hey, here I am. I'd like to say a big thank you to Allison for not only the presentation she made to the councils in person, but when we were in Nanaimo, but also the taking the time today. I know you accommodated us from working, from doing this from an off-site location to facilitate this technology. But I'd also like to thank all the people who participated on the webinar today, and for the submission of what were some excellent questions.